My name is Heidi Camp, and I'm the Vice President for Institutional Advancement for the National Humanities Center. And it's my honor to welcome you here to the center for what we think is going to be a really interesting discussion around the Beyond Despair exhibit that you are surrounded by. This exhibit is actually part of a year-long focus here at the National Humanities Center, a scholarly focus, looking at the role of the humanities in addressing global environmental issues. We've had some really interesting discussions with scholars, interesting publications, great research going on, and next week we have a three-day, actually, scholarly conference here at the center focused on environmental humanities and next steps, also titled Beyond Despair. This particular exhibit was created in partnership between the National Humanities Center and the Visual Art Exchange, and it was made possible through some really generous sponsorship support from RTI International, from Burroughs Wellcome Fund, and from Tukasi here in the Research Triangle Park, and we're very grateful for their support. To introduce the curator of this exhibit, I am delighted to hand the mic over to Brandon Cordry, who is the Executive Director of Visual Art Exchange.
Yes, thank you to National Humanities Center for hosting all the fantastic exhibitions we're going to put here. So it's my pleasure to introduce our curator, Joshua. He is, yes, hi Joshua. There are 5 of you up here. Joshua is an assistant professor of art at Appalachian State University. He's also an artist who works in multiple mediums, and often his work is centered around our natural environment. He's been in a slew of magazines, including National Geographic, and he was the professor of one of our director of exhibitions, which is nicely how we were able to connect with him and bring him down here from App, and he's been so generous with his time and putting together this panel. So thank you, Joshua.
You're welcome. So I want to thank everybody at the National Humanities Center and at the Visual Art Exchange for allowing me to do this and work with everyone. It's been a real pleasure getting to see all the artists and the different way people have approached climate change and just working with the environment. And so I really appreciate everything that y'all have done for me and letting me participate in this. I'm going to break character for myself a little bit tonight. As a visual artist, generally I am the one talking about my work for an hour or so, and tonight I don't want to do that at all. And so I've prepared some remarks because I tend to digress and then digress off of that digression, and it gets Baroque and real long-winded. So I'm going to read a little bit tonight. And I only have one slide of my own to show you. So it's not my own even, it's Carl Sagan's. And I'm going to start off with a quote from Carl Sagan. And many of you probably know the pale blue dot and what it represents and what it means. But I just wanted to start off with this little bit of his words. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There's nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. I think that we're at a really crucial time in human history right now. There are multiple threats to the environment. There are studies that show that climate change is accelerating at an unexpected and unprecedented pace. There is right now unprecedented flooding. There are cold temperatures that are killing people just when they walk out to their cars, melting sea ice. All of that points to a very uncertain future. And this exhibition, as Heidi was mentioning, is being presented in conjunction with the Beyond Despair Summit. And the website talks about that in terms of looking at what we've done and how we've approached the idea of climate change up until this point and kind of questioning how we can move forward. And even the title of the summit and the exhibition has really struck me in thinking about how do we move beyond feelings of just inability to do anything in the face of such challenges that no one has ever faced this before and we don't know what to do. How can we move beyond that? And a question that I've had occur a lot recently in conversation with colleagues is, what is the role of an artist? It feels oftentimes like our work is really inert and inactive, and we make things that are inspired by nature or inspired by these ideas that it feels sometimes like we don't get any traction, or we don't have the ability to make change. And I think that, to me, the role of the artist has long been to hold up a mirror and ask those hard questions. But the work of art for me, the painting or the photograph or the sculpture, is never the ending of that conversation. It's the beginning. So the artist, in my estimation, does their research, pours their energy into creating these pieces, but that's not the finished project. And to me, photography, sculpture, ceramics, those things aren't art. They're a tool that allows me to communicate with other people and create that third kind of space where a conversation takes place between the viewer and the artwork. And I think that the artists in this show, the works that I chose, don't feel like propaganda, and they don't feel like screaming protests. They feel like seductive, alluring pieces of work that invite viewers to think about the environment and their connection to it in really interesting, varied ways. And I think that beauty can be just such an agent that allows people those conversations that they might often be opposed to having or scared to have. And I think that's the kind of work that I chose for this show. And so I'm going to just briefly introduce all four of the artists on the panel, and then they'll each have a short period of time where they're going to present their work. We're just going to kind of pass the clicker down the table, and then after that's over, we'll invite conversation and questions from the audience. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to start with Daniel Carico. Our panel is really diverse in their background. So Daniel is an associate professor at East Carolina, and he was inspired by his childhood during the Civil War in the Balkans. His interest in history and science inform his artwork through inquiry in geopolitics and disappearing and changing landscapes. Since 1999, he's documented the endangered wetlands and dramatic changes in the landscape in South Louisiana. So he's going to talk to us tonight about some of those photographs and the way that he approaches his practice. Is that fair? Fair estimation? Excellent. Next we have Ann Wilson, who started in the arts as a potter, and she moved into arts administration and worked in the nonprofit sector for over 27 years. And she led several visual arts organizations in North Carolina and Tennessee, and along with that maintained her own art practice. And her focus is on communication and information that exists beyond literal translation. Her work is rooted in the natural world and functions as a marking of wildness and inherent knowledge both in the environment and in our human selves. Next, we'll have Justin Cooke, who photographs communities living on the edges. He believes that the relationships that fuel his photographs foster a deliberate life, and that these relationships can create change. And I was just telling Justin I was so mad at him about his picture because I have this whole series of photographs that looks just like that in my head, but then I was really happy that that's the only one in his series that looks like that. So we're fine, we're okay. And then finally, we have Claire Alexander, who grew up in the south of France, but now she's here with us in the south of North Carolina. She's a multidisciplinary artist who studied environmental science at Duke, and she's been a freelance photographer and videographer for many years, but recently started painting in the studio and doing street art full-time. Her work focuses on understanding how the natural and urban environments shape community history and growth. So now I want to turn it over to them. I don't want to take up a lot of their time or present my work. I want it to be about the work of the artists that are in the show tonight. So the first artist, if you can help me in welcoming all of them, but we'll start with Daniel Carico. No. We gotta do it. We're just gonna do it all at once. Don't worry about it. This is all part of it. It's all planned. Just wait, hold. This is the anticipation is building in you.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Brandon and Josh, for including me in this. I've really, it's a part of my practice. I have several different bodies of work that I'm working on, but this has been something that I've been involved in for the longest time. And as Josh mentioned, this was since 1999. I sort of fell into it by really with sort of higher forces of my undergraduate professor saying, hey, let's go photograph this place. And what you do is you just kind of tag along and you start working on a pretty interesting area. So in red is the area that I've been concentrating in the state of Louisiana.
Sorry.
Oh, I can go further back. Thank you. I always like to kind of address it through some historical images. So this is a map from 1831, and it sort of shows the Terrebonne area. Terrebonne also translates into good earth. And it's been a sort of historical area where Cajuns of South Louisiana lived alongside with indigenous people. And right in the 21st century, this area looks more like that. As a matter of fact, there's been some movement on need to correct maps of Louisiana because the bottom of the state is literally unraveling due to some to various different factors, which I'm gonna kind of address here. So when I started seriously looking into this is the best sort of way to explain it. The size of football field of wetlands disappears every 30 minutes in Louisiana. And that's by Dr. Gregory Stone, Coastal Studies Institute of LSU. That's sort of the image that stuck in my mind every time I returned there usually in May for about a week or two and photograph sometimes in February. I feel that winter light is kind of really interesting in Louisiana. And so these are some of my photographs of the same locations. I tend to revisit the same locations. So this is a partner of mine, a mentor, Dennis Siporsky, who I photograph a lot with. So this is in 2005, right before Katrina. And then if you look how far that the beachhead is, and suddenly right after Katrina and Gustav, that's how much sand has been removed. In 2008, so the front camp, or this house, this is a fishing camp, is the one that disappears completely, and then the back one in that one is now in the surf in 2011. And finally, this is one of the new photographs from the last couple of years. So it's deep in and it's, interestingly enough, it's still there. So it's almost like a marker that we keep looking at over and over again. And it's this geological force that's kind of distilled down to a matter of years or even months. And I've been photographing there in various different formats. I tend to really enjoy the panoramas. This was after Gustav, and that house was overturned on its side. And the effects of Gustav and Katrina. This is a parking lot in Marina. Then we skip to the BP oil spill. This is some of the first oil on the island, on the barrier islands there. And some of the literal drift. This boat used to be kind of surrounded with a beach, and now it's kind of drifting back and forth. These barrier islands are meant to move through geological forces. The Mississippi brings back the silt and sort of reinvigorates these islands, and then they kind of get worn out and pushed back. This is actually an artificial island that's been used as a phosphate mine there, and now it's kind of abandoned. A lot of the communities are disappearing. To Cajuns, sort of the main markers are these cultural, historical cemeteries, and this one has been paved over so it wouldn't sink any lower. So these are some of the most recent images, and I tend to look at these sort of images of the juxtapositions. And so now I'm going to kind of skip to the newest work. In the last couple of years, I've been photographing with panoramic sort of black and white image, so I can create fairly large photographs. And this is what really the nature looks like there. This is sort of the marshland there. And it's quite a beautiful and enchanting place, and it's very different from a lot of sort of interesting coastal areas in the United States, because the landscape sort of naturally turns into this into waterscape, if you will. So there's plenty of these little drawbridges there, and a lot of sportsmen actually build their own little fishing camps. Some of them, like this one, have the built-in nets that are used as the tide changes, and all you have to do is just kind of lower it into the water. And they'll pop open a beer and wait for the snack to arrive. But most of the communities are the ones that you may have seen before on pylons. Everything is basically raised above the ground due to enormous flooding. This is a town of Cocodrie. And I'm not necessarily looking at the landscape by itself. I've been always looking at how humans sort of adapt to the landscape, or how they change the landscape in order to sort of conquer it, maybe. So a lot of these are kind of interesting aspects to me. And Justin and I just talked a little bit about the Ile de Jean-Charles area. This is sort of a community of indigenous people of Homa Chitimacha Biloxi tribe. And this little town is kind of one of the first sort of serious examples of environmental refugees. The HUD has awarded about $50 million for them to actually leave, but they are not really interested in that. So this is what the community looks as of a couple of years ago. There hasn't been too many changes, but the levee system was built sort of excluding their little community. Basically, the levee system has been built behind them. So they've been kind of open to a lot of environmental problems. This is the only road that actually leads to the community, and it floods regularly on a daily basis with a high tide. So if you can imagine living at the end of that with water sort of encroaching on your increasingly smaller and smaller ground. There's only one street and one canal in the community, and a lot of these are becoming sort of more and more abandoned. And some of the houses that don't necessarily look abandoned are falling in disrepair just because of the financial and economic situation there. This is a different location. This is the only barrier island that has a continuous community there. This is the Grand Isle in Louisiana, and they have been recently stressed under really a lot of coastal erosion. This was in spring of 2018, with large chunks of the levee kind of being washed away. town of Leeville is another town that's kind of falling into the marsh, basically, because the new highway system has been built, and it sort of floats above them. Literally, it's like a giant overpass. So it circumvents the town that used to rely on the economy of the fishermen and sportsmen, people passing through. This is the same graveyard that I showed you in color, only this is a slightly different angle. And I think I'm finishing over here with the image that's included in this exhibition. The image actually represents what's happening a lot biologically. These forests of oak and pine are actually dying because of the intrusion of salt water. So a lot of these bigger plants that would hold the ground are now kind of slowly dying away, and the entire landscape is changing at a really alarming rate. But I still quite enjoy being there. It's cultural, it's really enjoyable. Food is great, people are fantastic, and I'll continue. I don't think this work will actually end ever. It's one of those that just kind of continues. Thank you. Let's try this again.
Oh boy.
Move this closer.
So far, so good.
Okay.
Just turn it. Yeah, there.
Oh,
Oh.
there we go.
Too far.
Okay.
Nope, the thing come back.
Okay.
You gotta jiggle it.
Jiggle it.
There we go.
Ah, okay. Oh, we're still on you a little bit.
Just hit it.
Yeah.
Ah,
Oh,
there.
sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
I forgot which one.
So thank you, Joshua, and VAE and the Humanities Center. Thank you very much for this. So it's so interesting to follow Daniel because this is the world that I was born into. It's at that time it was rural. It's coastal North Carolina, outside of Wilmington in an area called Masonboro Sound, and more specifically Whiskey Creek. So it was down a dirt road, sand, live oak trees, Spanish moss. And, you know, we grew up at a time when we were sent outside all day long. You came inside for lunch. You came inside if you were bleeding. Other than that, you know, you were outside all day. And so you just created these whole worlds. What was out there was our world. There was no separation. And that has stayed with me my entire life. I walk in the woods a lot. I went just a little while ago, actually, and your place is beautiful here in the woods, too. It's just so easy to go silent there. I'm sure we all share that experience. And I'm just crummy to hike with because I'm always going to stop and just want to look and, you know, talk and smell and listen. I think about the animals that live in the wildness. I want to make a distinction between wildness and wilderness. So wilderness is, you know, a sort of a construct. Wildness happens within wilderness, and it's wildness that I am interested in. I think it has its own intelligence. It has its own frequency. It's a frequency, a communication frequency that happens in and of itself. It's not one that we possess. I think we anthropomorphize it. I just read recently that trees had a heartbeat, you know, in that a tree would pump water once a day from its root system up to its branches. But I think, again, giving it the name heartbeat, that's our doing. So I think it has its own system, its own operating system, and we get to be the lucky ones who get to just watch a little bit, and that's at the root of the work. So again, I think a lot about the animals that are there. I imagine what might be there. I imagine where they might live. This was on a recent hike. This first grouping of works that I'm going to show you all came from, the starting point is a vine that I found in the woods. And you'll see that vine clearly in each of them. It's a darker vine. And my goal was not to make a specific object, it was to articulate the vine. So what would the reed do to better articulate the vine? And I use a random weave process, it's in the work here, that also tends to mirror the chaos. It's not really chaos, though. There is order in a random weave, just like there's order in wildness. And that's what I think about as I'm doing this weaving. The first one I'm going to show you, so this was wrapping. The vine that's in the background was the starting point, and it's part of a nest series. Nests have holes in there, so I imagine what animal might use this and how it might use this, and I want to make sure there are openings for the animal. This is open vine, and it's a pretty large one. It's probably maybe 4.5 feet wide by almost 6 feet tall, so it's a large animal. The vine, again, at the top is the starting point on it, and then it all came off of that. This is turn. Again, the starting point was the vine at top. Later on, there's two pictures that show a little bit about behind how I create the works. All this is using reed, so most people know of reed through basket materials. It's a vine. It's a cousin of bamboo. And like chair caning, we're sitting on chairs that have chair caning. So the caning is the outside of the vine, and reed is the inside of the vine. It comes from Asia primarily, and it comes in different lengths and widths, and it's just, some of it's very fine, very delicate. Some of it is very structural. This is spine. Again, this is also maybe about 5 feet tall. There's some openings, a little bit hidden, but they're on the side. Emerging. The opening is on the left-hand side of that. And then this one was a large commission. This is for the entry of the NC State Craft Center. So they wanted something to animate the space, and actually did this with a class. So I'll teach the random reef process in different places, and so a class and I built this one together. The starting vine, it was fabulous. Someone came in my studio in downtown Raleigh on a first Friday and said that they were getting ready to cut down this huge spiral vine from a tree, and did I want it? Like, absolutely. So they cut it down. I brought it in the studio. When I bring in vines from the wild, they need to stay in my studio about 6 months just to make sure that they're not going to deconstruct any further for exposure to air, heat, coolness, withdraw some of the moisture on it. So if it's stable, it's good to go after a bit. This is a sort of a turn. These what are coming up next are pods, and they were inspired by this walk at the NC Museum of Art. When you walk down the hill and look back up through the grasses, this was last fall, were all these just beautiful, glorious seed pods. And so what differentiates these is that they are self-contained. They are not meant to be nests. They're more protective. And this one was the first one. It was called Pod. This was a commission in Chattanooga. And it's pretty, again, they all are pretty large. So this one's about 4.5 feet wide by about 3 feet tall. They're all very lightweight because they're made of reed, but they're very structurally sound. Again, it reminds me of in the woods, what it comes about. I'm always trying to, again, articulate, translate what might be found out in the wild into something that we could bring into our home or into our intimate space. This is cross pod, and then this is double pod, which is in this show here. And I'm going to say I've really been watching it. So it's on this back wall, and the light has just really been animating it. And you'll see it later on this slideshow. That seems to be half of it. I'm always just amazed by how it illuminates itself in different light conditions. Again, similarities there. So this is of double pod. I wanted to show you, this is how they start. So this is the starting vine. I adhere to what I call my working wall. It's a piece of veneer, so I can pull on it hard. It's very strenuous. It's structural. I pull hard at the reed, so I have to latch in the starting vine. And then that's the very first reed that was to start the interior pod. You can see, so at the end, nothing holds it together. It's all held together by density and the interweaving. In process, though, zip ties are a girl's best friend, and string and tape, and it just, it's always part of the challenge, too, is how structurally can this happen. So that's the very first reed that was placed on it. And then here is, after the interior pod has been made, then this was the start of the exterior pod. And for me, what this was about, and thinking about the inclusion in the show, it's about protection. It's about the knowledge, when I'm speaking about the inherent knowledge that the wild has in and of itself. It knows what to do. And this, I would imagine, to be a pretty sensitive interior, and with maybe a harder outer casing, like a crab, but maybe then the softer interior, but it's a protective mechanism. What is coming up is I started thinking about what would it be to apply the wildness to ourselves as human beings. And I got this image of clothing, a dress, and I wanted to see what the random weave would look like. So this is called Little Black Dress, and it's life size. It was started on a dress form, and seems to have its own personality, like some of the other works do. And then this is Wedding Dress. This one is the last dress I finished. What is added to it is wax linen. So it's reed, and I've painted it, and then that actually has about 4,000 individual strands of wax linen on it, because it apparently needed more density and complexity on the surface. So, and then that's a detail on it. And then I also will occasionally do baskets. One of my baskets was inspired by this hike of this pine needle floor. This is called Pine Needle Basket. It's also wax linen. So instead of a traditional pine needle basket, it's wax linen knots. There it is, a detail on it. This is called For the Journey. The vine that you see on top of it is similar to what's in the back of Double Pod. I had 4 of those, and so the second one went into this basket. And it's about 4 feet long. To me, it felt half canoe and half shoe when I was making it. And that's a detail from it. I am struck always by the tenacity and the apparent supposed fragility, which maybe isn't. This is a big piece. It's my most recent one. It's called Suck Creek Road. The vine came from the Tennessee River outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Some friends pulled it from the river for me and saved it, and brought it back to the studio. And it's incredibly fragile, but it is tenacious. It will last. I think a lot, as I mentioned with Double Pod to begin with, there's the light, but then there's also the shadow, and that is another layer of the work. Here is the nesting instincts at the craft center again when the light's starting to come in low, and it seems to just add another element to the wall and expands the form. Here is emerging, I showed you earlier, and that was when it was at the Maria V. Howard Center in Rocky Mount, and the lighting on it seemed to bring this animal again forward that may, similar to what lived there maybe. I was so surprised by that. I have to say, when I first saw that one, I was very surprised by it. And this was at VAE, actually. This is when Pine Needle Basket was hung at VAE, and they put the light on it again, and strongly, and then this is what came through on it. And I'm always so pleasant, I'm just taken by what the shadows can do and the light. There's information. It's like the piece itself has information. When I say that the wildness knows what to do, it has its own inherent knowledge. So the pieces, in and of themselves, are half of it. The light conditions make the other half of it, the shadows, visible. And there's information in there too. There's Pod when that was lit, the one that I showed you that's in Chattanooga when that was lit too. And that really doubled the size of it. So I'd like to wrap it up too by then saying that yes, I think that the beauty and just that quietness, that inherent knowledge is what I keep going back to again and again and again. I believe that wildness knows what to do just as we do. We may not have the same frequency, we may not communicate at the same frequency, but we are certainly sourced the same, and we also have that knowledge. So.
Sort of. Can y'all hear me? Cool. So my project is actually kind of indirectly linked to what Daniel is doing. Basically, for the past few years, I've been photographing the plight to preserve a 150-year-old cemetery on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's slowly being eroded by the Pamlico Sound, which is a result of sea level rise and erosion caused by human interference with the natural processes that make the Outer Banks migrate and grow. And this is the cemetery. I don't know if anyone's ever been down to Salvo, North Carolina. It's like kind of between Rodanthe and Avon. There's a little day use area, a campground, and on the edge of it is this little cemetery. So this is it in 1970. You can kind of see it down there, kind of in the bottom left corner. There's a nice little shoreline, a marsh, some woodlands, and this is it at the end of 2017. Some more photographs of it. So what's interesting is my grandfather, he's from Stumpy Point. You wouldn't dare call that the Outer Banks to actual Outer Banksers because it's inland. But I grew up hearing all his stories about the area. I was fascinated by it as a child. I'd always wanted to get to know it in a more intimate way. One of his relatives, he was like also like my great aunt, a woman named Nell Wisewechter. She wrote a famous children's book in North Carolina called Taffy of Torpedo Junction. So I grew up reading that book about this girl Taffy who grew up on the Outer Banks with her Banks pony named Sailor, and how they foiled some Nazi saboteurs during the Second World War who were spying on the American war efforts out there. So it was always this place that was kind of mythologized to me. There's a lot of really good, powerful work about climate change out right now, especially photography. There's some actually, a lot of it even focuses on the Outer Banks, and it takes kind of a very broad approach to the changing culture and what the erosion is doing. And I didn't want to kind of reinvent that wheel, so I kind of wanted to focus on a small, literally 48 by 50 yard piece of land and how it was being affected, but also the people connected to it were being affected. So in some ways, it's a story about the environment, but it's also about memory and ancestral connection to a place. And climate change is very real. Sea level rise is very real. They're predicting that the northwest portion of the North Carolina coast will experience 3 feet of sea level rise, and we're going to get 6 feet globally by 2100 if things keep going the way they are. It's a lot of doom for coastal communities, but I really appreciate your sort of Carl Sagan approach to sort of our cosmic home, and I feel like in some ways Rachel Carson, her take on sort of the sea and the sea around us is similar in that it's the mother of all life, that it's the alpha, the omega, that we all came from the sea, and that one day we're eventually going to return to it. It's the idea that I'm trying to imagine the sea as a real live character and a journalistic story, a force that shapes culture, a force that erases it, an actual keeper of memories, a measure of time. Essentially, it's eternity itself. So I'm trying to photograph this work from more of a sense of wonder as opposed to a sense of doom. You can't ignore the doom part, but trying to make this, I guess, like you said, beautiful, to seduce people to care about it, because people don't like the facts, the raw facts. So the science about what's happening, though, is crucial. North Carolina has a lot of amazing climate change and sea level rise scientists. Orrin Pilkey from Duke, Stan Riggs from East Carolina. In the process of reporting on this story, I was kind of devouring their work, trying to understand the science behind it. And lo and behold, the Salvo Deus area is part of a 40-year erosion study that Stan Riggs worked on at East Carolina. So I found a treasure trove of data about it. So it's part of a major overwash plain that's no longer getting overwashed. So basically when there's a storm event, it washes sand and water across the island, and it builds the backside of the island, and the island migrates towards the mainland. But it hasn't really been getting much overwash since the 1962 nor'easter that pretty much devastated the Outer Banks. So it's losing about a foot a year, which is actually not a lot compared to some of the other areas, but it's enough to basically inundate the cemetery. But weaving that science together with some collaborative storytelling is kind of the ultimate goal of the work. So I've actually found a lot of this project through Facebook, which is kind of a new way to do journalism to me. But anyways, I met Jenny and Dawn here, who live on Hatteras Island. They run a group called the Hatteras Island Genealogical and Preservation Society. They're basically a bunch of history nerds. They would be essential to any newsroom if newsrooms were still a thing. They were so good at just getting things done and finding out information, and I was kind of mesmerized by them. Anyways, they were raising money and trying to work with the local and federal government and other agencies to build a bulkhead around the cemetery to kind of slow erosion. So they really welcomed me in. We really hit it off. Dawn is an expert at genealogy, and this is where things get really strange. So she traced my ancestry back through my grandfather to a common ancestor that she and Jenny are related to, who once was buried in the cemetery, but now she's not because the sound swallowed her. And that's her grave right there. And that's where it is today. It's gone, just kind of to the left of that little kid. So that's wild. Yeah. So this is another person who I've been photographing. His name is David Ambrose, but he calls himself by Cowboy. He fell in love with the Outer Banks and never left, and he was working with them to basically work on the bulkhead. So trying to photograph people connected to this place. And that's the bulkhead. So we go from this and that to that. It looks pretty good, but if you have a Category 4 hurricane that comes through, it's not going to do a lot. So let's be real. But they introduced me to Jean Hooper. If you're from the island, you pronounce her name Hooper, not Hooper, because that's the high tider accent. She is this sassy, strong, independent woman who grew up in Salvo. She's never lived anywhere else. For all her life, she's watched the sea literally shape and reshape and wither her home. Her grandfather was actually the cemetery keeper at the Salvo Community Cemetery. And when she was a kid, she used to play there all the time in the Deus area. There used to be an island in the Sound that her brother would swim to. She never learned how to swim, but she would sit there and float in the water until she sank, and she would jump up out of the water and go running back to the shore. So it's this place where there's a lot of memories and ancestral connection. And she still wants to be buried there, even if the sea ultimately takes the place. Just to show you how important it is to her, Irene pretty much devastated her little house. It's this like low-slung concrete building kind of on the side of Highway 12 as you're driving past it, like a lot of the larger houses that are up on stilts. And she keeps this photograph, these actually 2 photographs in her family Bible. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Roy Stryker, who was part of the Farm Security Administration, Dorothea Lange, all those photographs. So he was commissioned to do a project called the Standard Oil Documentary Project, and he sent photographers out all around the country, and some of them went to the Outer Banks. That's Jean at the far right, kneeled by her grandfather's grave. That Saul Libson, who's a photographer from that project, made this picture of her in the 40s. It pretty much ruined everything in her house except for some of these photos, so she keeps them in her family Bible right by the door in case the sound comes into her house again. I thought that was pretty poetic. That's the grave. That's their graves now. So what's interesting is the efforts to actually save that cemetery became pretty real this month. Jean's husband, Burtis, passed away suddenly, and they buried him out there. So I'm going down this weekend to catch up with them. So just kind of wrap this up. Also been photographing just physically, like the effects of the erosion and trying to visualize what that looks like. I love this picture because it kind of reminds me of Jean's hands. There's this old tree that's been killed by saltwater intrusion. I love how wind gnarled it is. It's kind of creepy, and every time I go down there, I make portraits of it. And recently, I've just been lighting it, treating it like it's a formal portrait of like some noble human. The ecosystem. This is a climate endangered type of shorebird called a willet. Thinking about sort of the Outer Banks is a place where things disappear and reappear. How do you visualize time that way? This is an old bottle that was uncovered at the shore of the cemetery from the 1800s. That was just pretty, I guess. That's all I got.
Oh no, we lost it. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, we're not. I mean, it's not on the television yet. Okay, we got it. All right, yep. First of all, thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the National Humanities Center and VAE. And thank you to all of you. I know you've been listening for a while, so just bear with me a little while longer. I'd like to start off with just a little bit about myself. So I grew up in, sorry, I don't know if this is too loud. I grew up in the south of France, in an area that, I believe is the most beautiful place on earth. There, the freedom I had to run to school through dried fields of wheat, to attend neighboring village birthday parties on horseback, to hitchhike to the Great Lake of Serponçon, really spurred my ambition to dedicate my career studying these ecological networks that cradled my childhood. However, throughout school and then throughout college, this ambition was only materialized through the succession of B's and C's, even in classes with course grades no higher than 100. Because of this ingrained in my mind, there became this idea that there was a right way to study environmental science, to accumulate knowledge about my surroundings. And unfortunately for me, that happened to be very focused on equations, graphs, and data. But I persisted. I was very determined to, becoming an environmental scientist. And then senior year of college rolls around, which for me was last year, 2018. And I stopped questioning, why am I not good enough for this? And I start questioning, who is telling me this? Who is telling me so? So I remember looking back at all my classes, and I needed 34 to graduate with a degree in environmental science. And out of those 34 classes, I only ever had one professor who wasn't from the US and who wasn't white, and only two women professors who were both white. And so I remember thinking this, just completely baffled in my room, wondering, how is this possible? How can this be that a discipline that advocates studying the environment, which evidently surrounds all identities, all cultures alike, how can it only be constituent of the same set of people? And more pressingly did this mean for me, a young woman of color, but also a self-proclaimed artist, who had a really hard time understanding and grasping these hard science techniques. Did this mean that I had no say in the future of environmental science and policy disclosures? And I think the fact that I'm, speaking to you now at this show about environmental humanities and theory shows that it really definitely doesn't. So I, get rejected, unfortunately, from a lot of the jobs I'm applying to as my graduation date creeps closer. And I start to realize, I'm definitely barking up the wrong tree here. And despite my firm belief that we need to keep, researching our changing climate, that we really need to keep doing that, my personal journey up until now showed that, the need to expand who is conducting this research is even more important. So I managed to convince my parents that buying a one-way ticket to Brazil is a good idea. Hi, Mom and Dad. And I just set off down there. I saved up a lot of money. I was waitressing my last year of school. So I saved everything up, and I bought a one-way ticket down there. A good friend of mine's mom was a gallery director in Sao Paulo. I sent her a quick email. I was like, I have a background in environmental science. I've been doing photography, videography for a while. Is it okay if I just, come over? And she said yes, so I began shadowing her around her gallery. I arrived in Sao Paulo, this major city, couldn't speak a word of Portuguese. But I felt so stimulated by everything around me. And I managed to land a small residency with her. She said, you'll have a month to work on a project. Then you'll have a small reception. And so, she was like, maybe you could do a video about Sao Paulo, your experience. And she also said I could use all the material in her studio if I wanted to. And I looked at the big canvas rolled up and all the tubes of paint, and I said, you know what, I think I want to do a painting. And so that's when this painting that's on the screen, it's back there, that's where that came up. So after, my realizations and my frustrations with the environmental science discipline within my institution, I knew I really wanted to focus on, people of color and their agency within environmental science. And how nature is also central to their identity. So I start researching all these things about Afro-Brazilians, and I fall on a few things about quilombos. Quilombos they're groups, they're communities of runaway slaves in Brazil. And while I was researching them, I was just finding all these incredible stories and incredible facts about how, when they ran away from the plantation, from the colonial system, they didn't have anything, right? They had nothing. But they managed to form identities and form cultures just by using everything around them, by using nature. They had to figure out, what can I eat? What can I eat? How can I heal myself? How can I cover my scent? How can I, bathe? All these things, just with nature. And I thought that this was the most brilliant thing I'd ever heard about or ever read. So here in this next slide, okay. These are all the different papers that I kind of used to conduct this research and to build my painting. I have biological papers, socioecological papers. I really just wanted to have a diverse and as interdisciplinary background to fuel my work as I possibly could. So I ended up focusing on a study that was happening in Bahia, in the northern part of Brazil, where there's over 500 quilombos. And these 6 plants are used, they're used in different things. They're used, I think, for healing. They're used for nourishment as well. And so I picked them from the study, and these are actually the 6 plants that are in the hair of the woman here. And they're really at the forefront of this painting with her interlaced in her hair. I'm trying to show not the dependency, but the symbiosis between community and nature, which I think we don't really think about too much anymore. So while I'm constructing this painting, I'm also learning about the massive deforestation happening in the Amazon in Brazil. and how, as I'm learning about these incredible landscapes, of these incredible resistance landscapes, really, and how they were able to fuel the whole identity for all these Afro-Brazilians, I'm learning that it's also getting destroyed and replaced by monocultures of eucalyptus. On the left-hand side, you see pictures of when I was traveling around Sao Paulo, and it's just endless fields of eucalyptus. I did some follow-up research, and this eucalyptus is actually turned into pulp and is made to create a really special kind of paper, really thin, really soft paper. In other words, it's used to make toilet paper. And this is what's in the background of my painting, just endless rows and rows and rows of toilet paper, showing that really just like the monocultures, the mass consumption of this commodity, and how, these forests and the deforestation happening is, I agree, it's a major environmental issue. It really is, for a variety of different reasons, but it's also a sociocultural one, right? Because it's erasing the legacy of these people, and it's erasing a central part of their identity. And this is just the first painting of a series that I did. This is the second one. Unfortunately, it got a bit damaged as I was traveling around South America, so I wasn't able to submit it. But this painting as well has a story about the leaves that are in this man's hair, the background, which I don't have too much time to explain right now. But yeah, so these two paintings really mark the beginning of my career as an environmental artist, and just mark the long fight that I'm committed to have to really broaden our modern discourse around environmental science. So my visa eventually expired in Brazil, and I had to figure out what else to do with my life. So I started looking at different researches, different opportunities around South America, and I applied to a volunteer position / residency program in Colombia. I got accepted, so I packed my backpack, rolled my paintings up, and hopped on a plane. And once I got there, my paintings were on display for 3 months during my time there. And the directors of the program really loved what I did, and they were like, what do you think about painting murals? What do you think about bigger? And I said, I'll do it, yeah, sure. So this is a photo of my first mural that I did for a foundation called Prosiera, which is a foundation that does a lot of sustainable agriculture around the Sierra Nevada, which is a region in the northern part of Colombia. And yeah, they do so sustainable agriculture, ecotourism. A lot of research is also happening there, and they had this office space, and they wanted me to paint it after they had seen the paintings that I'd done in Brazil. So I told them absolutely. They took me out to one of their farms, cacao, coffee, and avocado farms, and I spent the whole day taking pictures of everything around me. I really wanted to fuel this painting with a lot of the local plants, a lot of the local flora that was there. So on the left, there's a flower called the heliconia, which is one of the most beautiful flowers I'd ever seen. In the middle, it's a plant called the mataraton, which, it's the local name for it, it's not the scientific name. But it's dried and used as mulch, and it's put around all these coffee and cacao plants to help them grow. And the last one on the right, you can't really see it, but it's a fruit tree, and there are the fruits on it, and it's called the sapote. And a lot of the workers there, once they get a break, they climb on these trees like nothing I'd ever seen before and just eat these fruits. So I was trying to represent different aspects of the forest. Yeah, and then this is a second project that I did at a foundation that works with kids. It was a really interesting time. I was brought in there as an art teacher, a volunteer art teacher, and I held a drawing contest. I really wanted the kids of this neighborhood to be as, integrated and as involved with the project as possible. So we did this mural, and this was still in Colombia. And we projected on the wall, and they all participated, they all painted. And it was, once again, a really beautiful time. This is the final mural that I did in Colombia. I was at a nature reserve up in the mountains in the jungle as well. It was one of the most mythical, magical places I'd ever been. And so this is kind of what this mural is displaying. Lots of, once again, the local kind of flora and fauna. And in the mask, it's different iconographies of indigenous communities there, the Kovis and the Wayu. This is just, some photos of the area. There was a friendly toucan that visited us, which was really nice. And so just to, finish everything off, I think what I've been trying to do with my work is to just display to really diversify, our modern concepts, what we think about as environmental scientists and as environmentalists today. I'm really trying to show the bridges between community and environment to inspire as many people as I can. What I learned within the institution, right, environmental science is very focused on the technical aspects of it. It's very technocentric. But, I really want to emphasize that we have enough data. It's not data that's going to help us mitigate, the severity of forest fires, the severity of desertification. We have enough data to really understand that there are no loopholes and there are no exceptions when it comes to climate change. And really, what I'm trying to do here is have people connect, relate to people, see themselves through my work, because people relate to people, not numbers. And I think that's about it, yeah. Thank you.
You gotta go to your thank you slide. You gotta go to your thank you slide. Well, thank you all very much for listening to us. I think we have time for some questions and maybe a little bit of conversation. We have a microphone that can make the rounds. If anybody has one. It always takes that first person to break the ice. If nobody has a question, you got one, okay.
So this is for you, Ms. Alexander. I was very stricken by that portrait when I came in. And I'm curious because you said that you had been taking all these science classes and then you sent out this email and then you produced this. Had you been painting or did you just suddenly, this is phenomenal.
Thank you. I took one painting class my sophomore year of college. And I've been drawing since a really young age. And I'd always really just enjoyed art. I enjoyed, expressing myself as through any kind of medium as I could. But this was the largest painting I'd ever done. And one of my first pieces, I painted a guitar when I was also, a while back. Nothing compared to this, really. And I didn't really know I had this skill, honestly, either until I started. But I'm definitely continuing. And I'm really fortunate I get to, have this skill and have this way to communicate with my surroundings and with other artists, because I think it really is a gift, and I'm really using it as a tool to, power through. Thank you.
While you all cogitate, I'm going to ask the panel a question. So at the beginning, I mentioned that I think one of the most important questions that artists are asking themselves now is, what role does my work actually serve in society? What am I actually doing in making these things? And I wonder if any/all of you would like to address that idea. What do you think your work does really in the world?
Sure. I can jump in. I always, I always thought of. I'm also a little bit of science nerd. My background was in mechanical engineering when I was growing up in Yugoslavia, and so in a lot of ways, what I always think of as sort of role of art in relationship to sciences or to environment is communication. It's somebody already mentioned in a lot of ways that that chart, that data information is very, very useful, and I quite often look at the maps and look at a lot of sort of hard science data. But I think in order to relate the problem and sort of seek the question, it's always interesting when we turn it sort of into these visual metaphors and start speaking the language that doesn't necessarily answer questions as much as visually really posts the question to larger audiences. So that's kind of my short little answer for that.
I'd like to add on that. I don't know where.
Any of these?
Here, any of these?
They'll adjust it.
Okay, thank you. So I agree. I think we're all similar. You know, it's communication is at the root of this, and we all have our approaches to it. I think it's so easy to name. You know, we say a word. We'll say, I don't know, climate change, and then immediately it means something, and we're so used to, you know, news points and data points and images, and it happens so rapid. And I see our role as like slowing down for just a minute, you know, to be enough off that something looks familiar, looks like we have a commonality there, but we're also going to look a little deeper because we know intrinsically that something else is there. And that's that's our role, you know, is to make visible so that people linger and they understand. And with the great thing about art is that art's experienced viscerally. So half of our work is done, you know, when we can produce a work that, you know, conveys what we hope to. That's it.
I mean, I come from a journalism background, and you know, my discipline is constantly under attack these days by people who are liars and charlatans and people with their own reality and their own facts. And, you know, I mean, I think that photography, I think that good reporting that's character-driven, that focuses on real people can tell it like it really is. And I think it's a way to depict kind of unflinching truth about what's really happening and create a record of our time and set the record straight. And I think that, you know, the people that are going to be affected the most by climate change and sea level rise are going to be people of color first. And I think that good art should support what they're going through. It should show people what they're going through. And I think that good artists should collaborate with people in those communities so they can tell stories on their terms as well. And that's just part of the truth telling. So that's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to add on to all of these things. And what you were saying absolutely about, you know, climate change affecting people, it is going to hit people of color, and it is going to hit lower income people first and probably the hardest. So we really need to start, you know, not only listening, but really valuing how they, you know, relate to these situations and their stories and what, you know, what we can learn from that. And I guess with my artwork, I am really just trying to change what we think about when we think about, you know, environmentalists. And I know within my classes, I mean, we studied Darwin, right? We studied Thoreau, we studied Rachel Carson, and I agree these are very important people within the discipline, but like, we need to start broadening the curriculum, and we need to start bringing different voices to the table, because these people, you know, they are still very, very important for the discipline. But we need you know, people to relate to people, because that's ultimately what it is. Climate change, when you hear the word, it is a very abstract concept. You know, even like sea level rise, like what does that mean? You know, it happens over a really long time. And all the, you know, it's just, it is very confusing. So I think what I'm trying to do, I'm just trying to represent community, and I'm trying to represent people, because people are at the heart of this. They're at the heart of decision making, and we need people to come together. Yeah, we really want this to, not to go away, because it's not going to, but at least to mitigate, you know, the severity of all these things that are happening.
Thank you all for your fantastic presentations. I have a question about your process. You know, it's one thing to create work that helps to visualize the conditions on the ground of what we're dealing with climate change, the Anthropocene, those type of things. But on another level, the artists, I feel, when they create work, they're working through their own personal stuff sometimes. You know, like there's something, because you mentioned people connect to people, but you had to connect with the work on a personal level, and I'm just curious if you guys were working through things of your own as you were, going through the process of creating this slow work, and I'm looking at you, Miss Alexander, as, starting point for that question.
Well, I mean, I think as I said a little bit before, I was just trying to work through, my ideas that I, wasn't good enough to be an environmental scientist, that I wasn't that I just didn't fit the cut of being able to, be a part of this discipline. Because I think, in my mind, and this was just like a false idea, false concept, that environmental science was really related to a degree and related to, being able to manage all these complicated tools. But I really don't think it comes down to that. I think it comes down to, once again, the stories, and just being able to, attribute value to different kinds of stories, to alternative ways of viewing and relating to nature. So that's really what I was, thinking about when I was creating these pieces. And I also just, finished college, right? And I'm still trying to figure out what my mission is and where I'm going to go with this work. But I feel like every little piece is always a reflection of what we're going through at the time. And I know through all of my paintings, I can look back and I always try to integrate, different local flora or fauna, and I can pinpoint and be like, oh, I remember when I did this, these were the flowers that I remember seeing on my walk to, this as you as well. And I remember when you were talking about, walking out in the wilderness, and same thing, collecting all these things around you. And I think that's a really beautiful way to kind of think about it. The work is it's biographical, but it also, speaks to the wider community. Thanks for your question.
Any of y'all have answers to that too? How you personally interact, or things that you're working through personally? It's okay if not.
I'll add to it. So mine was, I started as a potter. I did paint for a while on the side too, but primarily in arts administration. And if you had time to make art, you didn't have the energy. And if you had the energy, you didn't have the time. And so, in 2016, I sort of came off the front lines, I want to say, and I still work in the sector differently though. And then going into the studio, I made a conscious decision to learn, to return to the random weave process, and I didn't realize the parallels that would happen. Yes, there very much were. It's a very slow process. You have the structure, and then you can wet a few of the reeds that are thicker and more structural and attach them, and then they have to set up and dry, and you go away, and then you come back in the next day, and you wet a few more reeds, and you weave those in, and then you go away, and it's layer after layer after layer, and it can take a month to do one work, because you can just do a little bit at a time, and this form happens. And what I realized, each line, it was like the painter's line. It was so interesting. I became aware that the line of the reed was how I translated the painter's line to create the work. So that was the line that I move around, which in a painting you make a mark here, and then maybe there's something over here. And that became my line. That was so interesting. And it was all about how I was, sounds a little hokey, but how I was weaving this new life, though, at the same time. And I was learning the language of random weave. It really does have its own language. It wants to self-organize, and I have to sort of nope, you can't go that way. You got to head this way this time. And so it has its own, I can't separate it then from myself now. And then that's what, in recognizing the wildness of wilderness, and what it looks like. Imagine a tree, like when you see a Christmas tree farm, right? And it's all lined up nicely. That is not a forest. That's not wildness at all. So we need that randomness, and I am counting on randomness. And so the more work that I do and the more comfortable I become with the language, the more that seems to come up, wants to keep being created from it.
There are things that both of y'all said that really resonate with me. Being frustrated with your education, when I was at journalism school, they teach you don't get too close to the stuff you're covering, and be detached and be impartial and basically be a sociopath. So I feel like my education was a miseducation, and I feel like it malformed me, because what's always come up is this sort of like relentless desire to connect with the people that I'm working with. And like I've always felt like I've done something more honest when I've been able to have that connection. And when I don't have that connection, I just feel like I can't do anything. And, so I feel like I'm unlearning sort of a toxic culture as I work through some of this work that I'm doing now. And, walking in the woods, I'm like here for it. I love that. I feel like in another life, I might have loved to be an environmental scientist, but only if I was out digging around all day, like Calvin and Hobbes style. But that's why I became a photographer instead, because I could be standing on the Pamlico Sound and the wind's blowing 50 miles an hour and I'm freezing to death, but I'm trying to make a picture of this old oak tree. And for some reason, that's really meditative. So yeah, I think I'm working through stuff, realizing that I'm photographing essentially, some relatives, because Dawn and Jenny, if their genealogy is right, we's kin. That's weird. And I think it makes it more interesting. So, great question, man. That was a really good question. Let's give him a round of applause. Really good.
Hi, I really don't have a question, but I would just like to say thank you for kind of introducing new perspectives to me. I'm a journalism student as well at UNC right now, and specifically in public relations. And for the past few years, it's just been like learning a lot about maybe careers in like consumer brands, and I feel like I've kind of had this like tunnel vision on what journalism is or what communications is, and I'd just like to thank you for kind of opening up that perspective for me and bridging gaps between maybe STEM and liberal arts. So thank you.
I think that's it. And thank you so much, Joshua, to all of you for participating tonight. Fascinating conversation. But also thank you for your work that you're doing, which is really important, and we appreciate that. We hope that you'll all stick around, have a glass of wine, some reception. You can continue some of these conversations a little more informally. But thank you for coming tonight.